They let her in because there was no one else. They kept her because of what she did. The rope they put around my neck the first time was a mistake. The second time, I'm not sure it would have been. I want to say that plainly so you understand where I was when all this happened. What kind of man was standing in that yard when Clara Finn walked through the gate and nobody stopped her because nobody thought to? There were 14 men on the Garza spread, and not one of them moved to block her path, not because they respected her right to enter, but because her father was 3 days dead and the ranch was bleeding and they all figured she'd be gone inside a week. Let her in. Let her see it. Let her understand why she ought to sell. I was not one of those 14 men at that point. I was in the bunkhouse with my left wrist wrapped in a feed sack and a bruise across my jaw the color of a plum, and I was trying to decide whether I had enough left to ride out or whether I ought to just lie there until something decided for me. My name is Cal Dryden. I was 46 years old that summer, which in the terms of that kind of work meant I was old. Not old like a grandfather. Old like a mule that's been rode hard, and the question on the table isn't whether he's still got use left in him, but whether it's worth finding out. I'd been on the Garza spread for 11 years, longer than any hand there, long enough that old Garza had trusted me with things he didn't trust the others with, the books once, when his eyes went bad, the breeding decisions 2 springs running, the handling of the silver-gray stallion nobody else could get a halter on. Long enough that when old Garza died, and the men started talking about who ought to step up and what ought to happen to the place, my name was in that conversation. And then it wasn't. The trouble was a man named Pelton. He'd come on in the spring, recommended by someone whose name I never got, and from the first week he was the kind of man who knows where the edge of a thing is and stays just inside it, not lazy enough to fire, not dishonest enough to catch. But money went sideways. A calf count came up short. A fence line on the north pasture got cut and mended so clean it took me 2 weeks to notice, by which time whatever had come through had come and gone. I knew it was Pelton. I had no proof. I told old Garza what I suspected the week before he fell, and old Garza said he'd look into it, and then he had his stroke and there wasn't any looking into anything anymore. The night after we buried him, I found Pelton in the tack room going through a lockbox that belonged to Garza's estate. I don't know what was in it. I didn't get to find out, because Pelton was faster than I'd given him credit for, and what followed lasted about 30 seconds and ended with me on the ground and him standing over me saying I'd attacked him. 11 of the 14 men believed him. The other 3 were quiet, which is its own kind of answer. So that was where I was. Not fired, they couldn't quite manage that, not officially, with the estate unsettled but set aside. The bunkhouse, the wrapped wrist, the bruised jaw deciding. I heard her come in. Not her specifically, just the sound of a horse and then voices, and the particular quality of the men's voices when they're performing something rather than saying it. I didn't go look. I lay there on the bunk with my arm across my eyes, and I thought about the 11 years and what they amounted to, and I came to the conclusion that they amounted to a feed sack on my wrist and a busted jaw, and that was about the size of it. She came to the bunkhouse herself. Nobody sent her. Nobody said, "Go talk to the crippled old hand in the back." She just came. I heard the door and I didn't move, and then I heard her boots on the floor, not tentative, not the walk of a woman checking where she's allowed to go, just boots on a floor, and she stopped at the end of my bunk and she said, "You're Dryden." Was, I said. She didn't say anything to that. I took my arm off my eyes and looked at her. 24, maybe 25. She had her father's coloring, dark hair and a square jaw, and she was wearing a divided skirt and boots that had seen actual work, not the kind women buy in town to look like they've seen work. She had a ledger book under one arm and her eyes were red but dry, the way eyes get after a few days of the other thing. "My father mentioned you in a letter," she said, 2 months ago. He said if anything happened and there was a question about the stock accounts to find you. I sat up, my ribs reminded me of Pelton. What kind of question? The kind where the numbers in the book don't match the numbers in the pen. I looked at her for a moment. Who else have you talked to about this? No one yet. Don't, I said, not until I see the book. She held it out to me. Just like that. Walked into a bunkhouse full of men she didn't know and handed the account book to the one in the back with a busted face. I don't know what her father wrote about me in that letter, but it must have been something, because she had the look of a woman acting on information rather than hope. I took the book. I need to tell you something about that ledger before I tell you what happened next, because the ledger is the whole thing. It's why any of it matters. Old Garza kept accounts the way he kept everything. Careful, exact, suspicious of round numbers. Every page had 2 columns of figures and a 3rd column of notes in his handwriting, tiny and slanted, in the particular Spanish he'd grown up with. 11 years of books. And what I saw in the last 4 pages, from March through the week before he died, was a man who'd started to realize something was wrong and had begun, in the way of old men who have kept records their whole lives, to document it. The numbers were off in a pattern. Not random, not careless, a pattern. The kind of pattern a man makes when he's skimming in a way he thinks is too small to notice, over enough time to become large. And in the margin of the April page in Garza's small, slanted hand was a name. Pelton. And below that, one line, Dryden will understand this. I sat with the book a long time. Clara Fenn, she kept her married name, I'd find out later from a man who died 2 years back. She was a widow at 23 and back at her father's place when the letter came. Clara sat across from me on the other bunk and waited. She didn't pace. She didn't push. She waited the way certain people wait, like they understand that the thing happening is real and there's no use performing urgency at it. Your father knew, I said finally. I thought he might. Pelton's been moving money through the breeding records and something else, the north fence. I told her about the fence, the cut and mend, the timing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, there are 11 men on this ranch who will say Pelton is honest and you attacked him. Yes. And 3 who won't say either way. I looked at her. You talked to them. This morning, early, a pause, and the sheriff's been called, not by me, by Pelton, yesterday. That landed like a second punch from the same fist. I'd known it was coming, somewhere in the back of my mind where things you don't want to look at live. A man who moves the way Pelton moved, who'd laid out that first frame so clean, he'd have the next one already built. He'll say you took the money, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Did you? No. She nodded. That was all. She didn't say I believe you, didn't say anything for a moment, and then she said, then I need you to show me everything. The fence line, the breeding records for the last year, the livestock count, all of it, before the sheriff gets here. I looked at my wrist, looked at my jaw in the reflection of the window glass, which was spectacular in its colors by then. Today, she said. Today, I said. I got up. We spent 6 hours out in that heat. She rode and I rode, and we covered the north pasture and the creek line and the holding pens by the south barn, and I showed her every discrepancy I'd found, and a few I hadn't, but that the ledger pointed at now that I knew where to look. She wrote in a small notebook as we went, not fast, not hurried, in the careful way of a woman who writes things down because she intends to use them. Once at the creek, her horse stepped wrong and nearly went down, and she brought him up so smoothly you'd have thought she'd been riding that particular animal for years. The men watched us from a distance. Not together, not in any organized way, just wherever we happened to go there was someone nearby, and the particular quality of that watching was the quality of men waiting to see which way a thing breaks before they decide which side they're on. Pelton found us at the south barn in the late afternoon. He came alone, which told me something, and he was wearing the easy face he always wore, the one that made him look patient and put upon at the same time. He didn't look at me. He looked at Clara. Miss Fenn, he said, I've been trying to find you. The sheriff's coming tomorrow and I want to make sure you're not, getting information from sources that might not be reliable. Mr. Pelton, she said, her voice was even. Did you cut the north fence in April? He blinked. I beg your pardon. The fence on the north pasture, the cut that was repaired so carefully you could only see it from the post side. Did you do that? A pause. The easy face didn't move, but something behind it did, some small recalculation. I don't know what he told you. My father's ledger, she said. Not Dryden, my father. She opened the notebook. Do you want me to read the entry? He looked at her a moment longer, then he looked at me, then he walked away. He didn't run. He was too careful for that. But he walked away, and that night I heard his horse leave before sunrise, and in the morning 2 of the 11 men had gone with him, and the other 9 were standing in the yard looking at Clara Finn and waiting. The sheriff came at noon. He was a careful man, not a bad one, and he listened to everything Clara said. She had the ledger. She had her notebook. She had me, cleaned up as well as I could manage, sitting across from him at the kitchen table. She laid it out the way you'd lay out cards, one at a time in order, with the margin notation at the end. Dryden will understand this. The sheriff read that line twice. He looked at me, he looked at her. Ma'am, he said finally, Pelton filed a complaint against this man. I know, she said, and I'm filing one against Pelton. We can discuss which complaint the evidence supports. It took the rest of the afternoon. The 3 men who'd stayed quiet, I learned their names properly that day. Emmett, Soto, and a young hand named Gruber came in one at a time and said what they'd seen and not said, and it built the way things build when evidence and testimony are actually pointing the same direction. By 4 o'clock the sheriff had what he needed, and Pelton's description was going out on the wire. He looked at me before he left. You're clear, Dryden. Sorry about the trouble. I didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say. Clara walked him to the gate and came back across the yard alone, and she stopped in front of me and looked at me for a moment. And I want to tell you what that moment was like, because it was the thing that made the whole previous 11 years feel like they'd been leading somewhere instead of just happening. She didn't say I told you so, and she didn't say I knew you were honest, and she didn't make any speech about justice. She just looked at me the way her father used to look at a horse he'd decided on, with the particular stillness of a person who has made up their mind and isn't in any hurry to explain themselves to the rest of the world. Stay, she said. Just the one word. I said, it's your ranch to run, Miss Finn. I'll do what you need. Clara, she said, and I'm not asking you to stay as a hand. I looked at her. She looked back at me. 24 years old and 2 months, a widow, and 3 days into the hardest thing she'd probably ever had to do, and she was as steady as anything I'd ever stood next to. I need someone who knows this place, she said, who knows the accounts and the stock and the fences and where every bad decision of the last year is buried, someone my father trusted. A pause. Someone I can trust. That's a lot to put on a man with a busted wrist. Something moved across her face that was almost a smile. Your wrist will heal. She was right about the wrist. It took 6 weeks, and it healed a little crooked. I can feel the difference when the weather changes, but it healed. The ranch healed slower, the way ranches do, 1 season at a time. We found 2 more of Pelton's cuts in the south fence that fall and mended them properly, and the calf count came up to where it should have been. And by spring the books looked like old Garza's books again, careful and exact and suspicious of round numbers. I moved out of the bunkhouse, into the small room off the main house that had been used for storage. Clara's idea, she said it was practical, and it was, but I understood it was also something else, and I let it be something else and didn't make any announcement about it. The men understood. Men always understand these things before anyone says them aloud. There was an evening in October, after the first cold came down off the mountains, and the light went gold and flat the way it does in that particular part of the country. We'd been going over the winter accounts at the kitchen table, the good lamp between us, her handwriting in the new ledger and mine in pencil beside it for the corrections. And she looked up at some point and caught me watching her face in the lamplight, and she didn't look away. "What?" she said. "Nothing," I said, "just nothing." She looked at me for a moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over mine, the one with the slightly crooked wrist. Just set it there, warm and still and not asking for anything. "You know what my father wrote," she said. "In that letter. You never told me the whole of it. He wrote that you were the most honest man he'd ever employed and the most underestimated, and that he was sorry he hadn't said so plainly while he could." A pause. "He said if there was ever trouble, and he thought there might be, you'd be the one standing when it cleared." I didn't say anything for a while. The lamp between us and her hand on mine and the cold outside the window, and the account spread out and the winter ahead, which would be hard, and then easier, and then genuinely something. I could feel the shape of what was coming, and it was the first time in a long time I'd been able to feel anything ahead of me that wasn't just more of the same wearing down. "He was a good man," I said finally. "He was," she said. "He picked good men." Her thumb moved once across the back of my hand. "So do I." I looked at her. She looked at me. Outside, one of the horses moved in the pen, the gray one, the one nobody else could handle, and settled again into the cold dark. I turned my hand over under hers. That was all. That was the whole of it. Some things don't need more than that.